Hi, this is Dr. Mary Kay Keller, and I am the podcaster for Life is a Learning Curve. And today we have with us Barry Goldstein. He's going to be talking on the family courts and how they fail children in abuse cases. Mr. Goldstein's background is in scientific research about domestic violence, custody cases, and he is a national expert on this topic. He has 37 years of working in domestic violence issues, and he's the author of 6 books. He's an instructor to a batterer program for 21 years, and director of research for the Stop Abuse campaign. He's the author of The Safe Child Act and an advocate for protective mothers and their children. Thank you so much for coming on board with us today, Mr. Goldstein, and for being a part of this podcast.
I'm looking forward to it, and please call me Barry.
Okay, thank you, Barry. And I'm Mary Kay. So let's talk a little bit about what you would like to present today. As I understand it, we were talking about coronavirus and about listening to the scientists and the family courts and integration of research. So I'm going to just let you jump in and you kind of lead us down this path.
Okay. One of the things we've learned with the present coronavirus crisis is that we need to listen to the scientists. And when we don't, people die, people get sick. And the problem is, in the custody courts, the same thing is true. We now have very substantial scientific research, and unfortunately, with rare exceptions, the courts aren't using that research, and so they are getting most abuse cases wrong. And just to give it the context, most custody cases involve 2 parents who love their children, who would not hurt them, and the courts tend to do fine with that. They're dealing with a good situation. The problem is about 3.8% of all custody cases that require trial and often much more. And the custody courts have thought of this as what they call high conflict, by which they mean that you have 2 parents that are angry with each other and act out in ways that hurt the children. The research tells us that a very large majority of these contested cases are really domestic violence cases involving the worst abusers, which are men who believe that she has no right to leave, and so they're entitled to use any tactics, including tactics that harm children, in order to regain what they believe is their right to control her. And so these are the dangerous cases, and these are the cases that the courts are getting wrong. And recently, a couple months before everything shut down, we got a new piece of research called the Myers Study from the National Institute of Justice. And that was the final piece to the puzzle. It was an outcome study. And in context with all our other research, it confirms what protective mothers and DV experts have been saying, that the courts are getting a large majority of abuse cases wrong. And one of the things that's particularly concerning, all of their mistakes are tilted towards helping abusive fathers and placing children at risk. And if I can just briefly summarize what we're dealing with, the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges tries to teach judges to use 2 particular studies. The ACE study, ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and this is medical research from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And the Saunders Study, which also is from the National Institute of Justice in the U.S. Justice Department. So we're talking about highly credible research. Fundamentally, what ACE says is that children exposed to domestic violence, child abuse, and other traumas are going to live shorter lives and face a lifetime of health and social problems. So it goes really to the essence of the best interest of the children. ACE also says that most of the harm from domestic violence and child abuse is not the immediate physical injuries, but rather living with the fear and stress that the abusers cause. And the courts, which are not using ACE, tend to be only interested in physical abuse, tend to be only interested in recent abuse, and that are just two of the standard mistakes that they make. So what this means is that when they don't use ACE, they are minimizing the harm caused by domestic violence and child abuse. The Saunders Study was designed to look at the knowledge of judges, lawyers, and especially evaluators, because the other professionals often get their knowledge or their beliefs from evaluators. And Saunders found that most evaluators and most judges and lawyers do not have the specific domestic violence knowledge that they need. And that leads to recommendations and decisions that hurt children. So when courts don't use Saunders, they're relying on the wrong experts, and that leads to decisions that risk children. So it's the worst of both worlds. They don't have ACE, so they're minimizing the harm. They don't have Saunders, so they're disbelieving true reports, and the children are suffering.
Yes. That was one of the first things, Barry, that popped into my head when we all went on lockdown, because as I shared with you in Tallahassee, I've had my own experiences with domestic violence. And I thought, all of the poor children out there that might be, locked in with someone who doesn't have their best interests at their highest priority, and all of the people who may be adults who experience violence, because it's not just domestic violence. Sometimes it can be an adult who's disabled with a caregiver who's not particularly kind, and so my heart, just went out wondering how people were dealing with this. So thank you for sharing.
Okay, we've seen some stories about the fact that victims of domestic violence are sheltering in place with abusers, and that's really dangerous because they can't get away, and it gives abusers even more control.
Right.
What we haven't heard about is the fact that courts are tilted to try to promote shared parenting, even in relationships with abusers, which is totally inappropriate. And so in normal times, what that means is that the abuser, might abuse the child, might neglect the child, and so the child might come back with bruises or a bellyache or something like that. But in the age of coronavirus, they can come back with a deadly disease. And the other problem is that sometimes the abusive father will use the stay-at-home orders to refuse to return the children. And so they're with the worst parent, and they're being separated from their primary attachment figure, and that is very harmful.
It would be. Can I ask you a provocative question? It's one that people pitch to me on a regular basis. And honestly, I never know really how to respond to it. Is they'll say, are the abusers always men? Because you hear every once in a while, I have a father who says, well, it's my ex-wife who's abusive to them, and they don't feel believed in there. Do you, what's your response to that?
I certainly want to avoid a false equivalency between mothers and fathers in terms of abuse. Certainly, there are individual cases where the mother assaults or mistreats the father, but overwhelmingly, domestic violence is a gendered crime.
Okay.
Most of the domestic violence homicides are men killing women. And one of the things that's interesting, when either a man kills a woman or a woman kills a man, there is almost always a long history of the man abusing the woman. So lots of times when a woman is killing the man, it might not fit the legal definition of self-defense, but that's really what it is. And you got to remember there's a long history here. For thousands of years, society allowed and encouraged husbands to control, to discipline, to assault their wives. There's no equivalent history of wives being allowed to control or discipline their husbands. And that history matters, so that wives, mothers do not have societal support for abusing their partners the way men, the way fathers do. And interestingly, the first law about what we might call domestic violence today in the United States said that husbands may not beat their wives on Sunday.
Mm.
In other words, any other day, it was acceptable. And that's the long history of tolerance of what we now call domestic violence. And that history impacts how people behave today, even if the laws have changed.
You know, over the years, I've had a question. Thank you for sharing that, because what I heard from you is that the courts don't have the ability to make the distinction between those parenting guidelines for visitation between a family that's, you know, just they get along, they're fine, they're just splitting. But when they start looking at domestic violence situations, they don't seem to know the distinction and how to apply that. Or do you think you mean, what is your perception? Is it because they haven't been trained? Is it because they think they have to apply that law the same way to all domains? I mean, what's your kind of feeling about why this is happening, why there's so much resistance?
Well, the Saunders Study says that court professionals need training in very specific subjects. Those subjects are screening for domestic violence, risk assessment, post-separation violence, and the impact of domestic violence on children. For the most part, judges and other court professionals don't have that information.
Mm.
There are many common examples of behavior between mothers and fathers, or husbands and wives, that courts use as if it proves or undermines reports of domestic violence. And let me give you some examples. A mother leaves but returns. She seeks a protective order but doesn't follow through. She doesn't have police or medical reports, or someone is observing the father interact with the children and the children don't show fear. So those are 5 very common situations. And the first 4 are common because women often have to do that for safety and other good reasons. The 5th is that the children understand that he wouldn't hurt them in front of a witness, so it's safe to play with a father that they still love. But court professionals who don't understand domestic violence you often use things like this to discredit true reports of abuse. At the same time, they're not looking for the pattern of abuse. They're not looking at incidents other than physical abuse. They're not looking at the motive of the abuser. They're not looking and focusing on fear in the mother and children. And so they fail to recognize domestic violence. The other problem is that they, I'm sorry, the court doesn't know what they don't know.
Right.
They are focusing on promoting shared parenting. And that is always inappropriate in abuse cases. But the courts view domestic violence and child abuse as an obstacle to what they're trying to create, rather than a warning that that would be inappropriate and dangerous.
Well, even with the term domestic violence, I've wondered over the years, and Barry, feel free to correct me. As someone who transcended that part of my life, I often felt like using the words domestic violence was kind of downplaying the fact it was assault. If I wasn't married, I could charge the person. So, I have the same issue with child abuse when children are harmed. It's like it's assault on another human being. One of the things we don't have in the United States, we were the only country until about 3 years ago, there were two countries, but even the other countries signed the Children's Bill of Human Rights. And sometimes I feel like it's more about the rights of the adults than it is about measuring it out equally and taking a look about what's good for each person in the family. And obviously assault isn't. And then my second response is, we haven't, even in the court systems, we're talking about physical violence and we're talking about ACEs. And I don't think the courts have been able to catch up because, well, like you said, they don't know what they don't know yet, as far as the trauma of emotional abuse. Because you first mentioned that it's not just about the physical element, but it's about the fact that the child feels so unsafe. I mean, that threat, that thinking that you're going to die so young, that's what causes a lot of the trauma, is realizing that you have to stay alive in this environment which people are supposed to be nurturing you.
Well, that's a lot. There's a lot of issues in what you said. One of the problems in terms of custody court and abuse cases is that in most of these cases, the abuser has only committed one or a couple of physical assaults.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't have to commit more, because once he has assaulted his wife or the mother, they know what he's capable of. And then the other types of tactics that he uses are more than enough to remind them what happens if they don't do what he wants. And the courts, which are not experts in domestic violence, don't understand domestic violence dynamics, and they miss that. And they say, well, maybe he used one or two assaults years ago, he's probably better now, or the fact that they're separated, they don't have to worry about it. But he didn't abuse her because of anything she said or did. He abused her because of his sense of entitlement to control her. And what that means is that he will abuse future partners, so that if he gets custody or unprotected visitation, the children are going to witness more domestic violence. That's one of the things they're missing. Now, in terms of the term domestic violence, I think most experts would agree that that's not a good term for it. And in terms of what you were saying, yes, it should be viewed more as a crime than anything else. But in terms of the term domestic violence, one of the problems is it focuses on physical violence, and most domestic violence is neither physical nor illegal. In the context of child custody, very often he's continuing his abuse through litigation tactics and through economic abuse, and the courts won't even think about something like that because they don't understand his motive and don't even think about his motive.
For instance, one of the cases that I heard that's a great illustration of what you just said was a professional woman who was in, I think she was in Park City, Utah, and she got a promotion in her job and wanted to move. And he went both through the church and through an attorney. And she literally, if she wanted to keep her children, had to cut her career off in order to just keep the kids. That's unheard of when it comes to men, you know. So, you know, that was phenomenal. And you know, people might say, well, it's not that big a deal. You have to make sacrifices for your kids, but that's not an equal playing field at all.
Well, you know, one of the things, the most common question we ask about domestic violence, which is also the wrong question, is why does she stay?
Oh, yes.
And increasingly, you know, the custody court system is the answer. That, you know, she's afraid that if she leaves, she's going to lose the children. And, you know, that is a very serious danger. And, you know, the courts don't think about that. You know, when we look at what works best to prevent domestic violence crime, one of the things that it's really important to help victims leave their abuser. And the custody courts are doing everything they can to prevent that. Another way of saying that is they're doing everything they can to prevent victims of domestic violence from gaining safety.
Mm. Barry, did they do, you know, it's kind of a broad question, I guess, because I'm thinking the entire United States. But do any of them ever get any training on this? It's not required, or it's not part of the domestic court's background to provide training so that they have training on these types of issues? I'm not familiar with it, so I'm just kind of curious.
You know, it depends on the locality and all that. I would say most judges do get training. Part of the problem is, what is the training? You know, lots of times the training can be misinformation.
Right.
Lots of times judges only want to hear from other judges, or else they'll hear from mental health professionals. I mean, there are trainings that include domestic violence advocates who are the experts in domestic violence, but most of the time that's not true. And lots of times judges think they know everything, don't want to be trained, so even if they're forced to go to a training, they don't pay much attention. I mean, a big part of the problem was that when domestic violence first became a public issue in the 1970s, we had no research. You know, the assumption was that domestic violence was caused by mental illness or substance abuse, and so they turned to mental health professionals as if they were the experts. And the problem is, we now know that the original assumption was wrong, but the courts continue to get their information from the same small group of mental health professionals. It tends to be an insular group, which is why they've been so slow to integrate current scientific research. It's not that they can't, and sometimes they do. I had a trial near Albany where I was the expert witness, and the judge had just had a training in the ACE research. And he was delighted to have an expert about ACE testifying. And every time the abuser's attorney objected, the judge would cite something I said to deny the objection. And it wound up that the children were protected in ways that they aren't in most cases.
Mm. That must have been profound to have that happen like that. And I mean, I know you've written your book, Do they have those kind of documents available for court or for judges to be able to read more about it? Whatever you did in that was obviously really effective.
There is good material. As I mentioned, the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, they tend to understand these issues. They do good trainings. They focus on ACE and Saunders, but most judges don't take their training. The people who take the training usually are already the ones who care and who know. And when judges are required to take a training from them, very often they don't pay attention. You know, it's interesting, Mary Kay. My organization, the Stop Abuse Campaign, had a series of conference calls with a group of experts from the National Council. And, you know, they were telling us, you know, the problems of trying to train judges who didn't want the training. And that's a big problem. And, you know, so there are some judges that understand it, are open and good, but most judges don't get the right training, aren't open to it. And because originally there wasn't research, the courts don't have a practice or a habit of looking to the research to inform their decisions.
Let's take a quick break there, Barry, just for a minute. We'll be right back. So, Barry, that was really interesting talking about the courts and the judges. And I remember you with, you know, a conversation that we had where we were talking about what we can do. I mean, systemically, what kind of changes do you think need to be made?
You know, Mary Kay, one of the things that really frustrates me is we now have really substantial research from highly credible sources. And if the courts would just use that information, they would be better able to protect children. And I think one of the fundamental things is that judges have heard over and over again that children do better with two parents in their lives. And that's certainly true in general. But children don't need both parents equally. They need their primary attachment figure more than the other parent. They need the safe parent more than the abusive parent. And when we're dealing with an abusive parent, it would be harmful to the child to lose the relationship with the abusive parent, but it is more harmful to have a relationship as long as he continues to engage in abuse. So the only way he can have a net positive impact on the child's life is to change his behavior.
And they can change their behavior. There's so many programs out there that have, you know, help people successfully do that.
Well, let's talk about that for a second.
Okay, go ahead.
You know, you mentioned, you know, one of my hats is that I've been an instructor in a New York model batterer program for 21 years. The research shows that only accountability and monitoring have been shown to change abusers' behavior. That doesn't mean an individual man couldn't take the information we have and change their behavior, but that generally doesn't happen. And as we said before, DV is not caused by mental illness, by substance abuse, by the inability to control their behavior. And so programs that focus on that are not just useless, they're harmful because they create the illusion of doing something. We know how to dramatically reduce domestic violence. And there have been communities like Quincy, Massachusetts, like San Diego, like Nashville, that have been successful in doing it. And it requires strict enforcement of criminal laws, of probation rules, of orders of protection. It requires, as we talked about before, making it easier for victims to leave. it requires a coordinated community response.
Mm.
And when men find out that the rules have changed, that the practices have changed, that if they commit domestic violence, they can expect serious consequences, they stop because they're able to control their behavior. The problem is that now they expect to get away with it because they usually do.
Mm.
So it's accountability and monitoring that is needed. And most courts don't know that because, again, they're not familiar with the research.
So those success, and that almost sounds like a pilot study in three different places. And I thought, if it's possible to do it there, and there are three different places, it's possible to do it everywhere. So, with modifications or whatever needs to be done in that community. I know that I was down in Florida at a time when they were experiencing a lot of rapes in Orlando. And they did a real community awareness program. And I'm not suggesting we do this with children. I want to be very clear about that. What they did with women was they had these gun training classes, and they started posting in the paper how many women were taking gun training courses. And between that and the other multiple strategies they used, the rapes dropped significantly down in Orlando, which told me that what you were saying, when the structure is there, they can and do modify their behaviors.
Well, Mary Kay, this is exactly what my book, The Quincy Solution, was about. And what really excited me, what really got me to write the book, was I saw a study about medical research and how the United States spends $750 billion a year on health costs related to domestic violence. When you add the cost of crime and of victims and children not reaching their economic potential, we are well over $1 trillion that we spend every year to allow men to abuse women. We can use that money better in so many other ways. But what I think is important, we already knew how to prevent domestic violence. The fact that if we do it, rather than having to spend a significant amount of money for the benefit of keeping women and children safe, we would actually save hundreds of billions of dollars, which ought to be the incentive for public officials, even if they don't care about domestic violence. And, think about our world today. And when we get through the coronavirus, crisis, and we have huge debts and the economy is going kerflooey and we have all these problems, here's something we can do that would improve people, the quality of life, and would save us probably about 500 billion a year that we can use for some of the other things we need. So that's really exciting.
It is very exciting. Did I hear you say $750 billion?
In health costs from
In
domestic
health
violence.
costs. And then I wonder, it has a ripple effect. Like, well, first of all, that $750 billion, my first thought was, yeah, we could totally overhaul the educational system with that. And then that made me think about teachers, and I know they see the signs and symptoms of it in class when a child can't study or they're too distracted because of what's going on at home, and the failure rates. And I noticed that when, in one of my readings that I had seen where you were writing something about, was that over 700 children involved in custody cases have been murdered in the last 10 years. Do you want to talk to, we're not just talking about the woman being in extreme danger. And I'm not saying that it's okay to abuse your kids, but the lethality scale just for the children who were involved in the area just shocked me.
Yeah, well, remember what we said. The fathers involved in contested custody are overwhelmingly the most dangerous abusers because they believe she has no right to leave. And unfortunately, they understand the best way to hurt a mother is to hurt her children.
Yes.
And we've had many of those cases of the 700 plus children who were murdered. The father told the mother, I'm going to kill the children and leave you alive so you can suffer the loss of your children. That's part of it. So, I mean, more often they're trying to punish her by taking the children away, by going after custody, by trying to bankrupt her. But the more extreme, will kill the children. And so we have had over 700 children in the last 10 years who were involved in contested custody, murdered mostly by abusive fathers. Mm. And interestingly, in my second book with Dr. Mohana, we had a chapter by Dr. Diane Bartlow that followed up on those murders. And she interviewed judges and court officials in the communities where these tragedies occurred and asked what I think is the most important question. In response to the tragedy in your community, what have you done to reform court practices? And the shocking answer was nothing, because they all assumed that the tragedy in their community was an exception. Mm. And that's what is preventing us from making progress. Courts assume that when they make a decision, assuming it's not appealed and overturned, that they did the right thing, when in fact, most of the time in abuse cases, they're doing the wrong thing. Mm. And, the child murders are the most dramatic because those cases, we know for sure they did the wrong thing. Most of the other cases, the courts are making the same mistakes, but instead of the children dying immediately by murder, they might die several years later by suicide or substance abuse or, illness or whatever that they wouldn't have suffered if the court had protected them. Mm. And, that's a big difference. And, the courts don't know that. And that's a big part of the problem. That's why I think the legislators are going to have to make changes to force the courts to use best practices.
To use it, and I just was thinking as you were saying that that almost sounds like the public needs to get involved in putting that pressure out there. One of the things that popped into my head, Barry, was I remember when Andrea Yates murdered her children. And I was, it was horrible. I'm not saying that, it wasn't and that the news media shouldn't have covered it, but I've noticed over the years that they seem to cover that at a higher level of fervor than when a man kills his kids, that it's just not illuminated in the same way. I think that's what I found so offensive, was that like the children didn't even exist, that it wasn't something that got covered a lot. And what I'm wondering is, like, now for myself, I'm a human rights advocate, but as a member of society, what can people that are listening to this podcast do to kind of help bring this into further awareness? Because obviously we need to do like community involvement, but also this judicial and legal aspect of it. What can the average person out there who hears this and thinks, okay, now I haven't experienced this personally, but I feel like this is something that needs to be addressed. What do you suggest to them?
Well, the solution to domestic violence crime is the Quincy solution that we talked about. Mm-hmm. The solution to child custody is the Safe Child Act. It has been introduced, I believe, in 5 states, hasn't passed yet, but hopefully when 1 or 2 states pass it, everyone will see how great it is and it'll be copied. As you mentioned in the introduction, I am the Director of Research for the Stop Abuse campaign, and the Safe Child Act is probably our leading effort. and people can get involved with us. They can help us to try to pass the Safe Child Act. And it says some very basic and some very obvious things. The first thing is, in all custody cases, the health and safety of children must be the first priority. Seems obvious.
Yeah.
It's not happening. The second thing is we want the courts to integrate current good scientific research like ACE and Saunders. Based on Saunders, we want the courts to use a multidisciplinary approach, which would include domestic violence advocates and child sexual abuse experts, not just, mental health professionals. That'll help. The next thing, we want an early hearing limited to abuse issues. And this is just for that small group of cases involving alleged abuse. And what that means is, number one, the abusers can't distract attention with all their various tactics. The trial would be just about abuse. Because if the father is abusing the mother or the children, we know what the outcome should be. Custody for the safe parent, and at most supervised visits for the abuser. And what that means is that cases that now take many months or years and tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars can be resolved in an hour or two, and we'll get better decisions.
Sorry, go ahead.
The next thing is, we want judges and other court professionals to be retrained, especially in terms of the research like ACE and Saunders, but they also have to learn that many of the beliefs and assumptions that they've been taught for 40 years are wrong, and they have to stop using it. And finally, we want the states to provide additional funding for domestic violence organizations so that they can play a greater role in child custody, both in terms of training judges and other court professionals, and also to serve as expert witnesses. And because domestic violence agencies are severely underfunded, I wouldn't ask them to do more without providing the funding to let them do that.
Right.
So that's the Child Act. And we can, your viewers can get involved in their state to try to pass this. Because when we get a couple of states to pass the Safe Child Act, our children are going to be living longer, safer, and healthier lives.
Well, and I was just thinking, Barry, that from what you were saying, I thought this is an election year. And I heard one of the candidates talking, in a different venue on police reform. And basically what they were saying was we're either, they can set up their standards and guidelines, and they could use the federal government's money as a requirement. You have to do this if you want money from the feds, in order to kind of push that change further. So, to our listeners, what I would suggest is start asking these candidates right now, what are you going to do about this? It needs to be a discussion on the table in order for people to become more aware of that. And to really kind of understand, it just blows my mind. Children are developing vulnerable human beings, like their brains are growing and processing, and how we can put them at the lower end of the spectrum. To me, it's like this: we should be holding children up, rather than, coming down and not really understanding how their developmental processes are affected by this. It affects them throughout their life if it doesn't get addressed. And that's, everything in my advocacy, I always say everything begins in childhood, and society is the result of someone else's childhood, last generation's childhood. And that's not to blame parents and society as a whole. Like you said, it's what we don't know that we need to know, or however you phrase that, because we have more knowledge now than we did when I was growing up about child development. We have more access to this information. So really, at this stage in our life, with the technology and the access to education and the documents that you've already listed here, that we have information. It's time to implement it. So.
Well, Mary Kay, if I could just mention, one of the things that is so exciting about the ACE research is that the present level of cancer, heart disease, diabetes, mental illness, substance abuse, suicide, all sorts of other horrible things is based on our long tolerance for what we would now call domestic violence and child abuse.
Mm.
What's exciting is that if we use that research for prevention, and I had the privilege of working with Dr. Felitti, who was the lead author of the original ACE study, he says now that prevention is the best use for his research. And if we do that, we can dramatically reduce those diseases and social problems, which would mean that we're going to increase our life expectancy, the quality of our life, and as we discussed before, we're going to save a large amount of money. So that's what's exciting, and that also could be the incentive for public officials. And what we need to understand is we live in a federal system, so most of the changes we need for child custody really need to come on the state level. And we need state legislators to sponsor the Safe Child Act and to make changes, for instance, for the Quincy solution and things like that. The federal government could provide financial incentives. They have been helpful in sponsoring some of the research that should be used to help on this. Unfortunately, the help that we were getting for many years has stopped in the last 3 or 4 years, but it could be returned if we have an administration that is concerned about domestic violence and child abuse.
Well, so what I'm hearing you say is, even though people think that this isn't a huge issue, it's a issue that dramatically affects different parts of society. Like you mentioned, healthcare, for instance, it's definitely going to impact, crime statistics. I mean, I think sometimes that we don't realize, just because we're not going through it, that somehow it is affecting some different parts of our systems. And so it does affect everybody, because we're not isolated. I just think sometimes we think everything's so compartmentalized rather than realize it has an interplay. I mean, an economic interplay. It has a health, public safety. I mean, at different levels, it does impact us.
The first time I did a presentation about the Quincy solution, which was at the Battered Mothers Custody Conference. And afterwards, a woman came up to me and she said, you really should have talked about the schools, because, what happens when a child is up all night or is, suffering because of the domestic violence or child abuse they're experiencing, and they act out in school, and the teachers and the staff need to take time out from helping other children to help a child who's been traumatized. And that takes away from everybody's education.
Yes. And it distracts the other kids as well. And that poor child not being able to function in that classroom the way they want to, doesn't understand, one of the things about PTSD is it kind of rewires your system. And so you don't necessarily always have the appropriate reaction, because the child can't figure out. I had read one time, I think it was called Islands in the Stream. And this has been about 20, 25 years ago. I think it was in the 0 to 3, when they were first when I was first aware of their publications, let me put it that way. They had said that babies or infants were actually capable of withholding their urine so that they wouldn't trigger an event, like a baby born into an abusive situation. And I'm not talking like a newborn, but a child in diapers would actually somehow they didn't know what was happening, but their survival mechanism would kick in, and that they would try to control themselves, and I thought, for a child in diapers to be owning responsibility, the impact, on these children psychologically, and possibly, like you said, their health at some point is just, it's incomprehensible to me.
We don't understand that young children are far more impacted. Many years ago, there was a story that I used in the batterer class. It was about a 4-year-old boy whose father was a NFL football player, and his father was assaulting his mother, and the boy thought that he had to protect his mother, and he got his orange wiffle ball bat and started hitting his father with the wiffle ball bat to try to protect his mother.
Mm. That's just heartbreaking that any child would have to step up like that. What do you, episode 2, this was really weighing on my heart. And, when we went into lockdown. And so I did a podcast myself and just told people numbers that they could call that were confidential, so on and so forth. Do you have any suggestions as the expert for somebody in this situation right now in a lockdown? Is there anything you can think of that would be?
In terms of protective mothers, certainly reach out to the local DV agencies. The Stop Abuse Campaign is helpful, the Battered Mothers Custody Conference. There are other organizations. Speak with other protective mothers. There are a lot of groups like on Facebook or elsewhere for protective mothers to talk with each other. One of the things I love about the Battered Mothers Conference is the mothers will help each other and find that after they've been attacked, for all these years, that other women who are easy to admire are going through the same thing. And inevitably they'll start talking and someone will say, it sounds like we were married to the same man.
Yeah, and I don't have any idea how to advise children, that might have access. I was thinking it's probably more likely to be teenagers, but obviously there might be support groups there as well that they can reach out and look for help or look for assistance as well.
That's exactly the problem with the court failing women and children, is not only do they not protect them, but in failing to protect them, they prevent them from getting therapy and other help that they need for healing.
Exactly. Well, it kind of sounds like we're coming to the close of this discussion. Was there any last minute things that you wanted to share that we didn't talk about?
I think we covered everything. What I would say is, if you want more information, I just put up a lot of new articles on my website,
Okay.
which is barrygoldstein.net, and you're welcome to have access to it. I would also encourage people to look at the Stop Abuse Campaign website. We're making a lot of changes. We have articles, we have information about a variety of issues, and we have a lot of material about child custody. And if you're in a position to do so, I hope that people will get involved to try to make the changes that are needed. The exciting thing is we have the research, we know how to fix it, we just have to convince the powers that be to make the changes.
Just to be able to get this process out there and actually be able to implement it. Well, thank you so much, Barry Goldstein. I really appreciate you coming on today. And to all of our listeners, I just want to say, empower yourselves and let's get out there and start asking these hard questions that we need to be asking in our community, our local and state and federal government levels. And also, I'd like to let our listeners know that if you've enjoyed this podcast, you can hit the message button and reach out and let me know if there are other topics that you would like to know about, or if you have any follow-up questions, then I'll be certainly grateful to pass them on to the speaker today. Also, if you feel like you've benefited from this podcast, please, for 99 cents, you can support this podcast as it goes forward. 99 cents a month is all it takes. So thank you so much. And everybody, please stay safe.